To ready ourselves for fall, I had already had the bones and the structure of SVP, our traditional SVP program, well thought out and well planned. But when March 2020 hit us and everything closed down for COVID, we had a number of decisions to make to take SVP from live to virtual. How would the students experience SVP? Because typically we have an understanding of who our freshman class are. And so we have that same information this year, but their experience would be a little different. I'll be talking about the SSO program and then future challenges for SVP going forward. So like I mentioned before, the planning and the structure, the bones of SVP, what happened on an annual basis, are already well recorded. But in moving to a virtual program, we had to consider recruiting our SVP leaders, we had to hire individuals, and we were already in that process when March occurred and we closed down due to COVID. So that really put the brakes on our program planning. We wondered if things would go back to normal by the time the SVP live programming would occur, but we weren't sure. I asked a number of administration individuals who I work with what our plans might be going forward for SVP and how we might continue our planning and be prepared for whatever would occur. So much like the 1918 flu pandemic, as we learned more about COVID-19, we recognized that we probably would not be back on campus for our fall SVP programming. There was no formal decision in place for quite some time, so we were really flying blind about how we would continue to plan our SVP program. We knew we had to, we just didn't know what form it would take. These were difficult, challenging decisions to be made. We had to determine if we would have some in-person programming and some virtual programming. We all faced the challenges of learning Zoom on the fly, figuring out what features would be most beneficial in having large groups for SVP go virtual. And so a lot of thought and planning went into a virtual SVP. I asked RIT Orientation what their plans were. They too were in a state of flux, unsure of what their plans would be for the RIT General Campus Orientation. And so I decided to look at the critical parts of SVP. For NTID, that's placement testing. So I had some discussions with the English department, the Liberal Studies department, math and science to help them help us envision what placement testing could be online. But all of that had to be initiated and implemented somehow. So that was an aspect of planning. Career sampling is another important aspect of SVP. So I spoke with the management team, administrative team, and department chairs. I asked them to hold some of their budgetary funds because we normally would have that for summer contracts. But we had to figure out all of the moving parts and how they would seamlessly come together to plan a virtual SVP that would make sense. It had to be accessible for all manner of students. And we had to consider how we would utilize the resources that we had currently to make that happen. There were a number of different courses within RIT and NTID that had to be considered. So I put together a comprehensive proposal in May. I consulted team members, management, and administration to assure that it was a logistical plan. It was something that we could execute. And this was new for all of us. This was new territory. So I just jumped in with both feet and we all did the best we could. We had a framework, again, that was well recorded, and so we built upon that. I continued with the framework we had. We continued with discussions throughout the summer with the community at large as well as administration. I really tried to get an understanding of what the students' perspective was. What was it that they wanted? What did they think about virtual programming? Did they think it would work? So after the proposal was submitted in May and a number of further discussions with supervisors, we decided to implement our virtual SVP planning. We established the online structure for SVP as we planned to execute it. So I certainly can't run SVP alone. It's impossible. I needed a team of people to work with me. Carissa Martin was my right-hand person. We worked very closely in the planning of the virtual SVP for placement testing, and we realized with placement testing we would have to have a number of proctors. We knew what it was like to work with English, and we had to work with Matt Stefano in math and another faculty member in English. We got their buy-in for the placement testing, but we still weren't sure how many people we would have, how many individuals would register for placement testing. And so we brainstormed our way through envisioning what placement testing might look like. So July 1 through 31 was placement testing timeframe. And we established a number of phases throughout that time frame. We knew that English had 3 critical tests: reading, writing, and a third type of testing. We wanted to make sure that the students took all 3 of those critical English tests. We knew that math had a number of tests that they needed to do as well, and they typically managed that through my courses. So we had to determine how to assign proctors in a Zoom structure. I worked very closely with Carissa. We were able to establish a Genius program. We communicated that to all the students because that was the platform that they would use to register and log into Zoom, so that the proctor would be able to be present for the exam and proctor the exam as well. But they wouldn't be present. The students wouldn't feel like a proctor was leaning over their shoulder watching them. So it was a behind-the-scenes presence. So there were a lot of logistics that had to be worked out for that to happen, and Carissa was wonderful. Another critical member of the team was Brian Lloyd. He was our career seminar coordinator. Brian Lloyd coordinated 11 career seminar instructors on his team. So they developed the curriculum that would be included in my courses. It would include the perspective of their team. So for example, Brian was on the committee with Jessica, TJ, Kelsey Wall was on the team. They all worked together very closely to develop a curriculum for the students to take. So during a regular SVP in-person year, we would typically have 8 days of career seminars. Each session would be 2 hours long, but in this new virtual plan, we had to adjust that entire schedule. And then Erin Clegg and Tim Elbert led our SVP summer program as our 2 directors. They assisted with the coordination on the student side. They worked with 15 orientation leaders. So again, Erin and Tim were critical as our directors working with the orientation leaders on the student side. They had to balance and make sure that the orientation leaders could cover our student groups efficiently and effectively, that communication happened for all parties involved, and there were a number of moving parts there as well. So again, our SVP preparations. Through March, April, and June, I worked very closely with RIT orientation. We didn't want to have anything overlapping or conflicting in our mutual schedules, and so I had to plan very closely in accordance to what RIT was going to do. I also had to consider the STEP Summer Transition Program, our STP program, and what they might have been doing virtually, because in the past, if they were in person, the STEP program would overlap with SVP in certain areas for 1 week of the schedule. And so if their programming was moved to include the entire summer being 6 weeks long, then I had to consider how they would be integrated into the SVP virtual program and at what point in their programming that would occur. So they decided to go to the FTP and create a fall transition program. And so we wouldn't have any overlap with SVP. So that decision being made, I then had to consider the new signers program, what we call NSP. They too overlapped with SVP during their scheduling, during the first week of SVP. So because that program was already in the works, and we had transitioned to an online program, and they had transitioned to an online program, I had to consider that whatever their schedule was, we had to align with it so we wouldn't have any conflicts. We didn't want any hiccups to occur with any conflicts or overlaps in a schedule that students had to attend to. So there was a lot of online things for our students to manage, and we wanted to be respectful of that. We had to consider both baccalaureate level students as well as SVP students in NTID programming. So when baccalaureate level students had other Zoom programs to attend, we had to monitor that and be aware of that so they could be available during our NTID SVP programming. So lots of moving parts. And then you may remember that during this summer, RIT sent out an email campus-wide offering college courses to incoming baccalaureate level students. It was a way for RIT at the time to offer one summer course to incoming students so that students could get a taste of what college courses would look like virtually before coming to campus live or virtually if they chose. So NTID mirrored that, and we offered our own online summer courses. Again, we had to consider a schedule that was mutually aligned so there was no overlap or conflict with any of the courses. So that's what we call the RNCCK. It's the RIT NTID College Course Kickoff. And that program was run by Linda Bryant and her team. I want to say there were 6 to 8 courses that NTID offered for our SVP students to take as an initial kickoff to their college experience. So all of that took place in addition to the SVP programming. We had to communicate all of this to families. We had to communicate with NTID admissions. We had to help them understand, because they would be fielding questions from students, so they had to understand clearly what our programming was so that they could best deal with students and parents. And we wanted everyone to have a clear understanding of what it is that they were signing up for. So seamless communication was our goal. We populated our website with as much information as possible. And around the end of June, I began to initiate our email correspondence with students and parents. Again, we wanted them to have detailed specifics about the programming that their students were registering for. We sent postcards to every student's home, again, trying to capture their attention, making them very aware that SVP was going to be different this year, that we were moving to a virtual program, and that it wouldn't be the traditional in-person programming that they would have, which would have started on August 9th. And they had that information in their acceptance letter that they received at their homes. But we had to let them know the SVP's start date virtually would be a different date, and that we had to change platforms because RIT Housing wouldn't allow any early move-ins to occur. RIT had to consider quarantine times during the summer. And so there was all of those housing considerations to think about. And so we had to inform our SVP students that the dates would be a little bit later in July, a different date that they were informed of initially, because they were planning to move in on August 9th, but all of those dates got pushed back and changed. So we wanted to keep students and parents very alert to any communications that they received and make them aware that dates could be changing, that things were slightly in flux because of the situation. So those were all of the things that had to go into the detailed planning of SVP, the logistics of it all. Really, the SVP program in person is very different from how an online version of SVP would run. We typically would begin every day in person at 8 in the morning and go straight through until the evening time. But if you consider a person logging on to Zoom at 8 in the morning and being online connected for 12 plus hours, it really wasn't feasible. The eye strain, the exhaustion of attending to a computer screen that long was physically not possible. So we had to adjust our online programming, and we had to reprioritize what was critical for us. Again, we knew we needed a way for students to connect to both ourselves and to one another, because building rapport is a very important first step for an incoming student. Some of the other things we needed to prioritize, again, were placement testing for our purposes and for rapport. So those were the two main things we considered when we developed our online SVP structure. Connectedness with students and trying to recruit students and keep them connected to us and appropriately placed with career placement and placement testing. So this is an outline of what the virtual placement testing programming looked like by date. Students initially received an email alerting them of some of the changes and letting them know what to expect of the SVP programming. That placement testing would occur online and that there would be 4 tests hosted. There would be a math, a reading, a writing, and another, the power of the written word test placement. Students could then look at a schedule of that placement testing, choose what worked for them. We would establish the schedule as well as the proctors for each exam. So I texted students, I emailed students, I had many touch points along the way to be in connection with students. We had established a Facebook page, SVP 2020, that students could connect with. They could meet each other virtually via social media. We also had a parent Facebook page. That was a little bit more quiet this year. I'm not sure why, but it was. The SVP 2020 page for students was very active, and I think students really appreciated having an opportunity to connect with one another virtually. And it was a way for them to stay connected to and get to know who we were as well. We monitored all of the placement testing, and we noticed after the first week that students did one of 2 things. They either registered and didn't show up for the test, but we noticed another group of students who simply ignored emails and they didn't sign up or register at all. When we recognized that trend, I reached out with Carissa. She and I worked together very closely to follow up with students, to remind them to register. And when they weren't responding, we were texting them directly, or we were sending them direct Facebook messages. We even went so far as to call their homes to encourage them through their families to sign up for the SVP placement testing. And that follow-up was fairly successful. We wanted to make sure that all of the students took the appropriate placement testing during the first 2 weeks of SVP. That's important because if there were students who qualified, they would be able to take the second level placement testing to determine where they might fit best within baccalaureate level math or the WPE written placement exam, for which English class would be most appropriate for their skill set. So those first 2 weeks were a critical time period for our placement testing. And if they needed to, there were 2 other MPE and WPE tests that they could take. But the English department needed appropriate time to evaluate each student's example and determine what placement level would be most appropriate for that student. So all of that had to be completed before July 31st. Also, we wanted to piggyback on some of the other efforts. Because NTID had made a prior agreement, we wanted to make sure that we communicated with students, and we hosted 2 SVP webinars. With NTID admissions help, again, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We didn't want to be having dual programming that wasn't in alignment with one another. I adjusted my presentation to further explain our online SVP virtual programming, and I made myself available for question and answer if necessary. We also had some evening webinars on July 15th and the 22nd. Career sampling is another important aspect of SVP, because when a student applies to RIT NTID, they have to consider a major. What we noticed during SVP is that their career sampling helps them realize that what they thought they may have wanted as a major doesn't necessarily suit them. And so we need the time and the resources available to allow that career sampling to still occur, but it needed to occur virtually. And we needed to work with our RIT direct admit students. In addition to that, our career exploration students needed some particular focus and attention with placement testing to see at what level they would qualify for programming. And if so, they would need to be moved to, quote unquote, a new home. Because students still needed to take their major level core courses in the fall, but we were trying to push that and ensure that every student had the appropriate placement testing and was in the appropriate level of coursework. So we tried to encourage the career exploration students or the CES students, when appropriate, to look for alternate programming. When majors were confirmed, I was able to email all of the SVP students. And if their major wasn't able to accept them, they needed to have time to communicate that back to me so that we could make some adjustments and work with the students. So again, a number of moving parts: career exploration and direct admit students confirming what their majors were so that they were best prepared for their fall placement. Of course, placement testing wasn't the only important part of SVP that we needed to consider. There was a number of other programming options that we had to fit into the schedule. And so we had a number of online events that occurred before our official start of SVP. We had what were called daily career seminar courses. They began on Monday, August 10th. But even prior to that, we wanted to have online connections introducing students to the RIT campus and opportunities for us to have dialogues with the student. We had a number of online events that we hosted. Both Aaron Clegg and Tim Elbert were very helpful in hosting What is SLT, the Student Life Team. So one of the reasons we did this, we didn't want to overwhelm the students during SVP programming time because of it being virtual. So we decided to spread out the schedule so that they had a little more time to slowly be introduced to a number of online virtual events that would introduce them and welcome them to the RIT NTID community via Zoom. Kevin Poor and his team presented on SAISD. Again, there were a number of other fun Zoom events and meetings using Kaput as a survey tool for students to have more of an interactive connection with SAISD. Aaron also hosted an introduction to the Disability Support Office, or DSO. It was an opportunity for students to ask questions. Students who may have been deafblind or students who have other disabilities to ask questions about their accessibility needs. And then we had a spoken communication online event that was hosted by current spoken communication student club members. And it was an opportunity once again for students to meet one another and connect virtually. Like I said before, the placement testing was July 1 through July 31. The result of that was that we were able to build student schedules for the fall. That took place on August 3rd. Actually, that entire week was an enormous amount of work. During a normal in-person scheduling event like that, we try to be very sensitive and aware to a student's communication preferences. We try to match those communication preferences with the communication modality and style of their professor. If a student is using some residual hearing, or if they communicate in a particular way, we want them to be comfortable with their professor. But because we weren't seeing students in person, it made it much more challenging to assess those communication modalities and preferences online. We've gotten a number of questions from students since that very last week in June, right through this planning time in August, for what their coursework would be like. And students had to make a decision if they were going to have online coursework or in-person coursework. But at the time they were asking us, we didn't know whether we'd be in person at all or not. I spent a lot of time asking my supervisor and the administrative team how we can plan around this, but no one had the answers. We worked very closely with NTID admissions, and they worked very closely with RIT admissions. And they flagged a number of requests online so that we could get a sense of what students wanted, be it online programming for their fall courses or in person. When the announcement was made that we would be in person, I still wasn't sure exactly how that would be executed. And so my questions continued to my colleagues and my supervisor. Because information wasn't released early on in the timeline, we had a very tight timeline to consider registration and for students to confirm whether they'd be online for their coursework or in person. But all of this cut it very close to the August 3rd schedule building date. And it left very little time for department chairs to build schedules, as well as all of the other moving parts that go into building student schedules. So we tried to give students a mixture of online courses and in-person courses when they requested that and when it was appropriate. But it was a number of additional layers of confusion and scheduling burdens that had to take place in building schedules. While all of that was happening, we had our career seminar instructors during the week of August 10th host daily career seminars. We had 20 groups of students. The average size of a group was about 6 to, I would say, 8 or 9 students in a group. Each of those groups was assigned to a career seminar instructor and an orientation leader that would host the career seminar courses for that particular group. So the group began to bond and know one another very well over that week. And these were topics that we would normally cover in person. We just shifted that programming to online. Students during that time attended a number of programming during that week. You'll see on the slide dating and relationships. We had a mini communication workshop. Student conduct hosted some presentations, and every evening there was a social hall that was hosted. That allowed students to get to know one another virtually on Zoom. What we noticed is that we had a number of breakout rooms that were available for students for that evening social programming. And they were themed breakout rooms. So there was games or just an opportunity to get to know one another, and students could join those at will. We had a fairly good turnout, but we didn't have 100% participation. And I'll say a little bit more about that later.
As I was explaining before, originally the move-in day for in-person was supposed to be Sunday, August 9th. Then RIT decided that instead of one massive move-in day as normal, where we have 4,000 people convening on the campus on one day, the RIT orientation team spread it out over 4 days. starting Wednesday, August 12th, and then went Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. So again, we had to think, before the discussion, we were thinking about which day should our students move in. I did notice that some of the students lived quite far. There were Californians, there was Hawaiians, so travel time to get here on campus made a difference. If they were driving, that might conflict with just the daily SVP classes that they were involved in. So we tried to figure out the best option. We decided to pick Saturday, August 15th. That was our official move-in day. However, in discussions about when the students could actually show up for on campus, it wasn't clear in the beginning when the students actually would be able to start. People were commenting, oh, if I show up on August 2nd, then I can stay in a hotel if I have to be quarantined, or I can be in an Airbnb, or I might be able to stay at a relative's home. Stay there for the 2-week quarantine period, and then come on campus the 15th. Or it was also suggested that students could move in directly on the 15th and then start their quarantine here. Well, it became obviously that we had 2 separate groups. One group that would show up in person and move in on the 15th because they clearly had already done their 2-week quarantine period. Or they would show up on the 15th, but then they would have to go to a local hotel to quarantine. So we were juggling those 2 groups of students as well. And then, of course, there were students that had been traveling, their flights were delayed, travel plans did not work out for whatever reason. A lot of questions came my way in talking about travel and quarantine. So RIT, their orientation group, their move-in was Wednesday through Saturday. Their official programming for orientation actually started on Saturday evening with a social hour, a fun program, and then the actual official orientation started on the 16th, and it went through the Tuesday, the 18th. So I had to build my SVP program around the events that were happening with RIT orientation. RIT hosted the diversity and inclusion video. The orientation leaders all watched that together as a group with their students, and then they had a discussion post. We also had planned for RIT Title IX office to provide the training, whereas last year we had a traveling theater group of actors, similar to Sunshine 2, same concept as that group, but they had come to RIT to perform in person. They were planning on coming, but one of the actors became ill, so we had to cancel that. So we had to modify our program for Title IX to become an online experience with the Title IX training. It was the same concept as what we all took for the COVID screening, or the COVID training, I should say. That same concept we applied to the Title IX training. Our students were all required to take that as well. Then the SLT hosted a quote-unquote on-campus tour. We had to limit that to up to 10 participants per group. People had to register, join a group, and those tours were led by their orientation leaders. Also, we had a convocation. We also had social events during the evening. We had outdoor movies. Every night we had a food truck show up on campus. One night we had a comedian. And we had other online social programs set as well. We had different Zoom events happening for all the different interests that our students have to meet their needs. And then on Monday, the 17th of August, the students showed up for the academic department meetings. That was when the student got their official schedule. And on they went. So Wednesday the 19th was the first day of classes. So looking back on that experience of the challenges we faced, I did notice that many students had a more wait and see kind of attitude. They didn't clearly understand, oh, that SVP is totally going online, even though I explained it in emails. Many of the students hadn't completely read the emails or weren't paying attention to them. Many of the students didn't read the fine print. I made my emails simple. I made them bullet points, concise. And yet many of the students didn't pay attention to those. Perhaps they were distracted with events that are going on at home. Many of our students have jobs. Perhaps that was distracting. So I must admit it was a little frustrating on my end that I was constantly having to chase them down. I had called them, I would text them, I would VP them to tell them to pay attention to their email. I don't believe it. They really realize that, oh, they are coming to NTID. So it was a bit exhausting, constantly chasing individual students and having to talk with their parents as well. Unfortunately, there continued to be confusion about when they were supposed to arrive on campus. Many of the students would read the official acceptance letter, and I would have to say, no, whatever was in that letter has now changed. We are going online. And right now we are talking about quarantining, and there are discussions about when the official move-in date would be. So I had to start communicating that information, that the 9th was canceled, that we were moving to the 15th. I tried my very hardest to keep August 9th as a move-in date and the start of the SVP online. I wanted to keep that. But RIT housing was not officially ready to open the dorms until the 12th. So I wasn't given early enough approval. We weren't allowed to do that, which was unfortunate. That really would have helped lessen the confusion, I feel, but we were stuck. So there was also continued confusion about being quarantined. For example, there was one student coming from Washington State who was very doubtful about when to come to campus. They wanted to move on to campus. But they're coming from Washington State. The airport was closed. She couldn't go get tickets. She didn't want to have to drive to campus from Seattle. So she would have to fly. And trying to figure out how to make that happen, she was confused. So then we realized, okay, they finally bought a ticket. They flew to Rochester. Her mom they actually booked a hotel together here in Rochester. But then 2 days prior to the scheduled flight, Washington State was removed from our restricted list. So now all of this had happened. Now what would we do? So she could officially moved into her assigned house at the RIT Inn, but her mom couldn't join her there for quarantine. So that was a very confusing situation. I felt so bad for them. That was just an example. There was a lot of confusion. In discussion with RIT housing, there were 6 area hotels that we quote unquote used for dorms for quarantine. But the problem with that was I had to remind people that those hotels, staying in the online booking was not accessible. They had to pay for an upgrade. It was really just awful. There was quite a struggle in joining the dorm meetings. It just was not a good situation. It really was not fair to our students. I did notice that just was another layer of complication in terms of accessing the internet, where the hotel internet was awful. They couldn't come to our classes or workshops. So we tried to work that out with our students who were quarantined in the hotels. Many students just were constantly confused. There was discussions about, should I stay on campus? Should I stay home and just do this online? Again, either they didn't pay attention or not read the emails carefully. There are several students that had already had their inbox filled with emails, so it was hard to find emails, and they were getting error messages in their emails, which was also frustrating. I know I'm moving quickly. I just want to make sure I have time at the end for any questions. So, who are our SVP students? I have an official count of 149 students currently on campus. Now, again, as I mentioned before, many students were unsure if they wanted to stay online or come in person. Some students did decide to defer their enrollment until next spring. So we did lose some students. We have 33 different states represented. And surprisingly, at the last minute, one student came from Africa, but that particular student is online. I feel bad that their classes are, I believe, 8 hours ahead of us. So the time difference is crazy for that person having to do their coursework online, but they're continuing to keep up. So we do have one international student. Remember, every year, students are required to fill out a CBQ, which is a language and communication background questionnaire. I think I got the acronym wrong, but we noticed there were 39% of the students. This is not the baccalaureate level students, this is just the SVP students. Among the SVP students, 39% use ASL, 29% do not sign, 23% SIMCOM, 25% of our entry students have cochlear implants, 41% use their hearing aids, all, most, or at least some of the time. It's interesting how that changes over the years. We notice about a third are oral students, a third are signing students, and a third typically SIMCOM, use both sign and spoken. Every year, people always want to know our mindset list. We're not officially ready to send that out, but I found a few tidbits that I could share. A college came up with this mind list, and they've transferred it to other colleges, and now it's called the Marist College Mindset List. This year it hasn't been posted, so I just selected a few bits of information. This generation of students that are coming in typically are 18. That means they were born in the year 2002. The World Trade Center never existed in their lifetime. They have grown up with stories about how their grandparents knew where they were on November 22nd when JFK was killed, just like we grew up with that. Their parents have grown up with remembering where they were when 9/11 happened. For many of us, that might have felt like just yesterday. These students never saw Mr. Rogers on TV. And these students have always been able to refer to Wikipedia. They have never used an old-fashioned encyclopedia, never. There has always been a Prius on the road for them. Survivor has always been on TV for them. Oprah has always had her magazine published in their lifetime. And films and movies have always been available online for these students. If you're curious and you want more information, I encourage you to look online for the Marist College Mindset List. Again, it isn't posted yet, but it will be. I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about the bachelor degree level students that we have. There are 73 that have been accepted in the bachelor level. It was hard for me to juggle both SVP and the SSO students, the supported students orientation. This is they're supported by Mary Carol Matchett and by Karen Bader. They made most of the preparations and plans for those students. We had 2 sessions online through Zoom. Tuesday, August 4th, we invited parents and the students before the official start of orientation. We hosted that event just to explain how these students will be supported throughout their college years, how to request an interpreter, how to get all the supports that they would need to support them through NTID. It's a collaboration between RIT and NTID. We also had our SSO students show up and moved on August 12th, that Wednesday. Again, I didn't want to complicate things for those that were quarantined. So we planned for 6 college groups. We had the College of Engineering, the College of Science, the College of Art and Design. We had the students grouped in groups. So we had 6 on Zoom and 2 were in person. That gave the students a more in-depth talk about what the supports look like, how to request all the services on campus. While the other webinar on the 4th was for parents and students just to kind of get an idea and to remind them that on August 12th we would have a more in-depth seminar. So my experience, this has been my 10th year running SVP. I have now done in-person and online. In a nutshell, I want to explain what we're going to be doing moving forward. What is the future for RIT, NTID, SVP moving forward? I would really like to see our students integrated more within the RIT programs. One complication is with RIT orientation and our orientation, the communication in what was going to happen with quarantine students. Their orientation made our students in SVP a bit confused. It was almost as if we were competing programs. So I want to see if we can join with RIT orientation to be able to blend us more within or embed ourselves into their program more. I need to have more discussion about the placement tests. We saw that doing those online, and we're trying to figure out how that will look going forward. We have to figure out how the career exploration programs will look going forward. We'll have to have more discussions about that. We recognize that the SVP students absolutely need more face-to-face time and support. And trying to figure out how to best do that is still something we're trying to figure out. We'll have to go back and look at the mission and the structure of SVP and see how we can best succeed in that. I'm hoping that with what we did this year, we can get a pulse from more people about what we can do in the future. More information is to come.